Hello everyone! Welcome to another episode of Let's Have Renaissance with the Daykeepers. Thank you so much for joining us today. We hope you're enjoying your day wherever you are. I am Ito Otini.
And I'm Micaiah Otini, and today we're here with Rebecca Macijeski. Rebecca is a poet, editor, and educator. She is the author of two collections, Autobiography and Apocryphal Girl, and holds a PhD in English with a focus in creative writing from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln and an MFA in writing from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Rebecca is an associate professor and coordinator of creative writing programs at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana.
Before we begin, I would like to ask you for a favor. The goal of this podcast is to support our fellow writers and artists and highlight their work. Please help us by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Thank you so much for being part of our journey. Rebecca, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really excited to have you. Can you please share a little bit about you and your work?
Sure. So I'm our coordinator of creative writing programs at Northwestern State University in Natchitoches, Louisiana, which is not where I'm from. I grew up in small town Vermont, moved through my graduate degrees through Vermont again and Nebraska, and now I find myself in Louisiana, where I wear lots of hats at the university. I'm the faculty advisor for our student-run and student-edited Art and Literary magazine, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary, so go Argus.
Congrats.
Thank you. Yeah, it's exciting. And the editorial team is fabulous. They're bringing all kinds of ideas. Other hats I wear, I teach poetry. I teach creative nonfiction. I also teach our Writing as a Profession course, which, gives students some guidance and practice in figuring out, okay, you want to be a writer. Excellent. How are you going to sustain that once you're outside of a program? How are you going to figure out how to pursue publishing? Because I'm passionate about the fact that I want to change the paradigm. I went through 3 degrees in creative writing, but never had a lot of directed guidance in how to pursue publication. So that's something I bring. And outside of my teaching self, I do primarily write poems, although I've been experimenting a lot lately, moving into the creative nonfiction space. A few years ago, I started teaching creative nonfiction based on a course rotation need, and I've been falling in love with the possibilities there. And there also seems to be a moment happening right now of a lot of writers who kind of initially identified as poets, also moving into the creative nonfiction space for the fluidity and possibility of expression it offers. So I'm curious about that. I think my writing is also inflected by my years as an orchestral musician. So as an undergraduate, I double majored in English with a focus in creative writing and music with a focus in violin performance. So I've played in a number of orchestras when I lived in the Northeast. So those kind of dual creative trainings, I think, really influence initially my writing self being drawn to poetry, because I think poetry, perhaps more than other genres of writing, is really interested in not only what the words say, but how the words say, the kind of sonic auditory influence, how different choices of a synonym for a word versus another option might bring in a whole other cluster of associations, kind of relevant to how you stack a chord in music, how the words are how the notes are in a certain order might influence how you receive that chord sonically or emotionally. So those are the kinds of things that I'm interested in. I'm also curious about lots and lots of different things, and they enter into my work. Sometimes I'll be writing in response to some of my reading in the fields of popular neuroscience, or researching, life cycles of an octopus. And then I'll be trying to write, persona poems, reimagining myself as different sort of selves in the world. So I'm a little bit of a magpie. And sometimes, depending on how my self-talk is going, that feels a little bit like something to celebrate, or is like something to get organized about. But that's sort of my general response. It's difficult to say exactly what my writing does or wants to be, because it's changing all the time. It's following different curiosities, different genre expressions.
You said you've lived in different states. I'm curious, which one of them is your favorite and why?
That's interesting. They're in different seasons and different eras of life. So when I was a child, I lived in Vermont, and we had a teeny house in a teeny town, but we had a big old backyard. So I loved all the backyard things, the blackberries and the grasshoppers and the campfires we would have, and catching lightning bugs, and the view of the mountains and the changing leaves. So the environment was really beautiful in Vermont. I think when I moved to grad school, I moved to Nebraska, which is maybe not my favorite, even though the Midwest gets dumped on enough, and I don't need to add to that sort of pile-on mentality. But it did expand my sense of, I think, the landscape of what a poem can be. You know, in Vermont, there's lots of small valleys, small towns, small pockets. The mountains are older, so they're softer and more worn down and not as tall. So I think maybe my poems, when they were still trying to figure out what they wanted to be, were comfortable being a little bit cozy. And then when I moved myself and them to Nebraska, we were staring across the flat horizon, miles and miles and miles in every direction, and kind of had to reorganize, recalibrate. But now that I live in Louisiana, I'd say this is my most favorite place I've lived. I think Louisiana is so rich with all different kinds of cultures and mixings of things coming together. It's another small town, but it's a southern small town compared to a northern small town. So I'm learning all the different idiosyncrasies that come with that. And because I'm teaching at a university in a small town, there's a certain specialness that comes with that. You know, my husband also teaches in the department with me. So we'll be out, doing things on the town, and someone will come up to him and say, "Hey, Mr. Montgomery, I remember when I took this class." Or someone will come up to me and ask me a question about a poem they're writing. So I love that community element, but I also love the idea that this is a place where lots of people come to become different things. When I was on my campus interview to potentially move for this position, someone told me that he loves this town because it seems like it collects interesting people. So I hope that I would be an interesting person to collect. That's kind of an idea I try to live up to.
And how do you feel like the ethos of that town is showing up in your writing now?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So last year, I wrote an essay and a presentation for the Louisiana Studies Conference. The theme was Lyrical Louisiana, and one of my colleagues helps direct that conference, and he's been encouraging me to submit something to present for a long while. And since the theme was lyrical, and I'm thinking about the interplay between lyrical, creative nonfiction, lyrical poetry, I said, well, to myself, if I'm not going to submit this year, when am I going to submit? So I thought a lot about what it means to become from a place, and that was what my essay and my presentation were exploring. The essay is becoming from here, a poet comes home to Louisiana. And I think something I'm continually curious about always as a human who's creative and curious, and especially as someone who expresses that curiosity through written language, I'm always curious about how we are or aren't connected to certain places. I don't know a lot about my, personal, cultural, familial, genealogical heritage. I'm part of, that whole cluster of a lot of us who kind of are American and white and only know certain small things about where we come from. And I think in the past, I've used that self-imposed outsider status as a barrier to connecting to wherever I'm from. And I've really since I've moved to Natchitoches, Louisiana, I've really tried to get away from that self-imposed outsider status and just look at, okay, well, what does it mean to become from a place? What are the connections you form? What are the relationships you cultivate? And also in that essay, just thinking about, the different milestone memories of onboarding to a new location. I have memories of, small towns have this sensibility where people know the last names. People know, well, you were cousins to so-and-so, and you're the third generation to go through this school. And you remember when, this storefront on this intersection downtown was 3 different Mexican restaurants before it became the whatever it is now. And so I'm remembering moments like that when I came to town. And one of my core memories was I went to the bank to open my new bank account, all these normal things you need to do, mundane things when you move to a new location. And I showed my driver's license and they saw my name and the teller said, Macijeski. I haven't seen that name on any of the gravestones. Put me on notice a little bit, like I'd have to earn coming from here. It didn't feel confrontational. It just felt like an interaction I wasn't expecting.
Sure.
But I think there's a sense of, being in a small town. I think now that I know a little bit, some of the differences between a northern small town and a southern small town, I think folks are protective about their home. So I just want to make sure that I'm a good neighbor, good resident. And I'm thinking about that. I'm also thinking about the interplay between, what it is to be university faculty and the rest of the folks who call this town home, and being really interested in those different intersections and different perspectives.
Do your students also come from everywhere, or are they mostly from Louisiana?
It's a mix. It's primarily a regional institution, so a lot of folks come from Natchitoches, and Shreveport and Alexandria are the two kind of largest cities that are nearby, and the surrounding parishes. But folks do come from neighboring states, and we do have some particular programs that draw a lot of international students. We have a really, really strong creative and performing arts program, so we have a lot of students who come from Columbia to study music. So it's an interesting little influx of different kinds of students.
You also teach the business of writing. Can you talk about that?
Yes. So the specific course I teach every spring, and it's a required course for folks who are English majors with a concentration in creative writing, but it's also open to minors and, interested, dedicated students who are writing in other majors and other disciplines. But it really felt important for me to give some guided framework for exploring how any writers, but especially young writers, how you can figure out what are your own tendencies and behaviors and habits. Because, those of us who are in the writing game for some number of years, and then it starts to accumulate into, decades, we accumulate these pieces of advice people say that are generalized and don't acknowledge that we're all individual, unique humans with different tendencies. So we talk a lot about in that class about when people say, well, all quote unquote, all good writers write every day, or the best writers write in the morning with, a candle lit, 2 hours before everyone else wakes up. And we talk about how some of those are ideals that don't make sense given, the real life practical parameters that individuals have in their lives. So we talk about how do you pay attention to how your brain likes to work? When do you feel like you're most productive? And try to create patterns around, instead of changing to meet some abstract model that might not apply well to your life, paying attention to what your natural habits are, and what are the habits that feel supportive for continued sustained practice, and what are the habits that feel like maybe they're barriers, and how can we change our habits to make showing up for writing easier. I think I'm trying to remember in my master's program, there's the writer Robert Vivian, and he has a ritual. He does show up daily. That's important to his writing practice. But he also has this phrase where he says he shows up without hope or despair. So just show up to the work of the writing without, being, depressed or despondent before you're anticipating no words come, or putting so much pressure that this is going to be the time, you open the amazing, brilliant opening passage to your new novel or the best poem that's going to, win some prize. Just show up. And we talk about what does it mean to show up in very practical, tangible ways. We look at examples of creativity and discipline, not only from writers. So we look at visual artists. There's this interesting Netflix series called Abstract that has single episode profiles of creative folks in lots of different disciplines. So we look at how creating discipline isn't something that only writers need to do, but we don't talk about it as much. We talk about in other disciplines that folks pursue. If you're a musician, for example, there's a standard of, performing your scales and your etudes and certain numbers of hours of repetition practice. If you're an athlete, you need to keep up that daily conditioning or whatever it is that's specific to your discipline. But we don't talk about that in writing as much. There's this kind of expectation that, well, you're creative in some general sense, and the words will happen because you're a creative genius, and we don't know how it happens. Well, we do know. It's about attention and showing up. And then the other piece is in the class. I consider the class having two main objectives. The first objective is, learning your process and creating sustainable habits that work with your process as an individual, quirky, idiosyncratic human. And then the other piece is looking at how do you prepare your work for publication, how do you do the work of publication, and I'm really transparent. I show my submission tracking spreadsheets and my submittable cues from the beginning of my submission history, and I think that's really helpful for students to see that, okay, yes, they have this image of me, for sure, I'm a tenured professor, I'm a published writer, but I get hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rejections just like everybody else. And then it seems like I'm hoping I'm creating a sense that there's less distance between where I'm at and where they're at. There's just been more time in the exploration.
For our listeners who are writers and who are sending their work out and trying to get published in magazines, what advice do you have? Like, when does a writer know when their work is ready to send out? How do they decide where to send it? What advice would you give?
I think my first instinct is to respond on kind of a global practice level. So I think it can be really useful to have lots of work in lots of different stages of the process, so you're not resting your sense of yourself, your sense of your worth as a writer on just a small subset of what you've written. So I think it's really great to, as much as is possible, always have some work that's really beginning, like it's really new. It has that spark of energy where you're curious. You don't really know what it's going to be yet, but you're excited about it. Have some work that you've already drafted, that you can be in that, tinkering, revision, secondary discovery phase, and then have some work that's ready. I think that helps because one of the things I talk about in that class, and one of the things I think about for myself and my own practice as a writer, is there are lots of kinds of work that, quote unquote, count as being a writer. I mean, the most generative phase is, of course, when you're making words appear where there were no words before, that new generation phase. But researching journals where you might want to send your work, that counts as I was a writer today because I did that for half an hour or an hour, or revising, or, gathering your pieces. Sometimes it takes a while once you have I think of multiple pieces because I'm primarily a poet, so I have lots of single poems and lots of pieces that once I've written them separately, I have to figure out how they interact with each other. So that gathering and accumulation, okay, maybe I've written 10 pieces and I have to figure out, are they in some larger conversation that can work toward a chapbook or potentially a collection. So seeing how the pieces speak to each other, I think having that global sense of what are all these different facets of my practice that make me a writer can be helpful in terms of feeling ready for publication. Again, to just reiterate what I said earlier, then you're not resting on this poem has to be who I am or what I am as a poet. It's just part of the process. I think for me, what's been really helpful, especially remembering when I was early to submitting for publication, that felt really strange and alien. Some of the words even about that process, submission feels very like passive, like you're offering up your work for judgment, and technically you are, but it feels a little bit, disconcerting, like your work becomes not yours anymore. But I think separating out the joy of creation, the joy of discovery and experimentation from the sort of mundane stuff of record keeping and organizing and sending stuff out, that feels really important. Trying to figure out how to organize in your mind, sending my work to probably be rejected doesn't somehow dampen or poison or take away from the joy of I wrote an idea and I love what came out of my brain. And then from the practical side, I think when you start submitting, when you start, trying for publishing, give yourself grace and permission to mess it up. I mean, even, the writers who have won the awards and are have the beautiful Instagram pages and are doing all these interviews, they had to begin somewhere. And, they probably have stories of when they sent their very first set of poems to Poetry Magazine because it was the place they heard of. But they know now, retrospectively, well, maybe that wasn't a good first place to send when I don't even have a bio yet. But we do those things. We're human. I think there's a high level of perfectionism and competition in publishing. And I think sometimes the fear of making a mistake or the fear of being perceived as somebody who doesn't already know how to do the process is a pretty significant barrier, and a realistically difficult one to overcome. But I think that's an important thing, trying to separate the worth from the work, trying to separate the worth from what result does or doesn't, land for you, and maintaining a long game.
What advice do you have for students and for listeners in relation to reading? Because one of those pieces of pat advice that you hear is like read a lot, and it's true. It's not inaccurate, but there's more to it than just reading a lot. You actually, especially in the 21st century, you have to have a strategy. Like, how are you going to approach reading? What are you going to read? When are you going to read? In what way are you going to? Are you going to read critically? Are you going to read immersively? Like, what advice do you have?
Yeah. So I agree that reading a lot of different kinds of things is important for fueling and seeding new creative ideas and new creative work. I also think I might think about the directive to read a little bit more expansively, where read doesn't only mean consume text. I think read means be curious and act into that curiosity. There's a quote, and I'm not going to get it exactly right because I should have saved it. It was a tweet from several years ago, and I didn't take a screenshot, but I think about it all the time. The poet Chen Chen, I forget exactly what the context was that this quote was coming out of, but he was speaking to this idea, another kind of generic piece of advice that's useful for some and not useful for other writers is, this idea that you need to find your voice. And Chen was pushing back on that because I think this idea of finding your voice means it's a closed, completed objective. Oh, I know who I am. Boom. Okay. But we know in order to sustain your curiosity, your creativity, your written output over time, that's got to be a continuous discovery. If you find your voice and, quote unquote, figure out who you are, what's the objective to try to figure out what else you could be? So his alternative is, instead of finding your voice, discover what you're curious about. And I think about that all the time because curiosity is something that, if it's authentic and genuine to your way of being, is something that's never over because you read something or you listen to something and you find a new pathway to discover. So sometimes if we're looking at reading not only as literally, consuming text, we could look at reading as figuring out what are the musical artists that you love and going deep into their discography. Like David Byrne just had a new album drop, and I know he has a discography that spans decades, but I don't know all of the Talking Heads stuff. I don't know all of his stuff, and I'm so obsessed with his recent album that now I'm excited that I have years and years and years of things to go back and look at. Also, I mentioned in my class, my writing as a profession class, I think it's useful to be curious in ways outside of your home genre. So I don't only read poems. I don't only read, in this larger metaphorical sense, literary work. I'm really curious about, there are all these documentaries now about how chefs figure out, what their purpose is, what their aesthetic design is, and you can watch whole documentaries on their thought process. So, like, what is the contribution to the, genre of food or fine dining or pizza or barbecue that I'm going to make as an individual? I find those things fascinating. I'm always reading about what we're learning now about psychology and popular neuroscience, how our brains work and how that impacts us as writers and us as readers, what our brains are actually doing to process the language. So I think that would be my general advice. If read a lot feels a little bit, overly homework calibrated for you, then expand the definition of what reading is. Be curious and make sure you're fueling your creativity in lots of different ways.
I really love that. A lot of people intuit that the opposite of depression is happiness. Having gone through spells of depression, I've come to the conclusion that the opposite of depression is curiosity.
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I don't think you can be depressed and curious at the same time. Maybe you can oscillate between those states rapidly, but I think, if you can access that curiosity, you're engaging with the world. You're engaging with something outside of yourself, and you can't be stuck in your own morass of negative emotion.
Curiosity is a pursuit. It's an action.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of curiosity, I'm curious, can you read some of your work for us?
Sure, absolutely. I'll read 3 short poems. They're from my first chapbook titled Autobiography with Split Rock Press. And the conceit of the poems in this chapbook is they were all written in that sort of COVID isolation time when a lot of us were feeling not only isolated from the world, but isolated from our favorite selves, not able to do the things that, allow us to follow curiosity and bring joy. So each of the poems begins with a metaphor for my brain. And I'm also playing with the idea, the title of autobiography. Usually you get a story, not with me, not from a poet. You get metaphors. So I'll read 3 short poems. Piano. My brain is a piano. I like the fact of it, all the keys to try, the plunking, each new sound growing accumulations. There's the smoothness under my fingers, the gliding, then the resistance, the pressure, the weather of my thinking coming alive in hammers and strings, 1,000 reckless decisions. It's meant as a closed system, but what if I opened the heavy box to its highway of humming metal and slipped things like memory between the strings? Picture it, this naked gratefulness of sound with feathers and oak leaves where the quiet should be. Curled bits of fortune cookie paper. You're only as strong as your cooking, and a home is what your heart makes, and remember the children, how they dance and see. Like filling a funeral, like the flowers on a death, but something stays wild. Like I'm saving everything, like I'm mapping a world. Paper cup telephone. My brain is a paper cup telephone connected by string to the neighbor's house. I am a child speaking big and small secrets in for safekeeping. I tell it my height and weight in case my body is lost. I say all my favorite words so it will hold forever the sound of my voice holding them. I won't tell you them now. You might give them away. The paper cup in my hand is a trumpet, a music box, a metaphor. It becomes a beautiful ear. When I talk into it, it's like I've climbed inside. I imagine my words building up, gathering charge, then shooting their lightning across the string to whoever's on the other side. An elephant, a god, some other perpetual motion machine. What I'm saying is I'm still here, sending storm after storm. Like the one summer as a child when I would bring my mother glasses of water she didn't ask for. I think I was taking care of where I came from. That same summer I learned about fireflies. They appeared in the yard like distance, like humming, singly, then in whole strings along the night. I learned how to follow them, to move quietly, to bring my hands home around one and become a lantern. The story I'm telling you is the story of becoming what I am. When I whisper in the paper cup, then hold it to my ear, I'm reading the sky again for fireflies. I'm listening for the flash. I'm becoming the light, my hands yellow gold against the dark. And one more. Where my heart is. My brain is where my heart is. It's her turn to host dinner at a little table in the kitchen, at a big window overlooking the yard where flashes between neurons look just like migrating birds. My brain and my heart are old friends. They've kept touch over letters, and now they text each other too. Sometimes sloth memes, sometimes a photo of a leaf lying in the road, the exact size and shape of sadness. My brain drives the long way today on the road that hugs the river. She knows the curves like she knows her blood. It's the same liquid motion, like a promise or a haunting. The red light by the liquor store, the turn at the Baptist church, the one with the marquee that reads, "Be gentle, there are feelings everywhere." And after just enough nostalgia songs on the radio, she pulls into the driveway with the beehive mailbox and the sweet olive trees perfuming the air for the 3rd time this fall. It's finally cooling. They're finally together again. a hug at the doorway, and soon they're laughing over soup like they were never apart. Stories pour out of them long past nightfall, until the world fades, until all that matters is this meal they've made, until they remember their sisters. They can tell each other anything.
That's lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Do you have anything else you'd like to say before we sign off? Maybe any advice on topics that we haven't covered?
Maybe here's a final thought. So something I think about when I think about myself as a poet, and I think about myself as a writer, as a creative person, as an editor, as an artist, as an educator, and as all the other human things that have multiple names, partner, cat mom, grower of plants. I think if I try to encapsulate all of the work that I do into one as small as possible little nugget polished phrase, I think it would be about opening up possibilities. I think it would be about emphasizing the power of creativity, and especially a creative life, in making sure that we don't become passive to all these forces that try to tell us who we are. I think that becomes more and more important every day in whatever lens you're looking through, if it's, political or national or global or economic. I think there are so many forces that are trying to tell us who we are and trying to cloud our ability for us to discover who we are. So I think maybe that's something I would like to leave listeners with, is thinking about creativity as a tool to make sure we get to decide who we are and no one else. We don't relinquish the power to anyone else to decide that for us.
All right. I don't know if we can top that. That's great. So
yeah.
let's stop while we're ahead.
Sounds good.
Rebecca, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for reading, and thank you for sharing your thoughts and your wisdom.
Thank you, Ito. Thank you, Micaiah. Appreciate it.
Thank you. You have a lovely day and enjoy your weekend.
Thank you so much. You too.
Bye.